We are pleased indeed to welcome Rafael Moneo back to the Getty Center. It was here that he accepted the 1996 Pritzker Architecture Prize. The jury citation for that prize nicely sums up why we invited him here today. It states, Moneo, quote, is above all an architect of tremendous range. As an eclectic, defined here as selecting and using what is best from all sources, which includes his own creativity. His flexibility in varying the appearance of his works based on their differing context is reflected in the way he takes on each new commission as a fresh exercise. He draws on an incredible reservoir of concepts and ideas which he filters down through the specifics of the site, the purpose, the form, the climate, and other circumstances of the project, end quote. With an extensive body of work in historic cities, he is familiar with the challenges of building on what is already built, and is also familiar with the debate on the topic within the heritage sector, having been a keynote speaker on an international conference in Vienna in 1995, which in fact resulted in the UNESCO Vienna Memorandum on World Heritage and Contemporary Architecture, entitled Managing the Historic Urban Landscape. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Rafael Moneo and his talk, Buildings Aren't Objects Alone.
Good morning to all of you, and I would like to start saying how happy I am of being here once more in LA, and I should recognize my gratitude to both Tim Whalen and Paul Goldberger for asking me to be this morning here. And then I would like to begin by recalling when it was that concerns about how to build in the historical city began to appear. I would say that in my view, that happened in the late 50s, years when the awareness of the value of the historical city started to emerge, perhaps triggered by the recognition of the failure of so many doubtful buildings characterized by a blind confidence in the principles of modernism. Le Corbusier had been explicit in his Plan Voisin when saying that Paris should be torn down to make way for the new city. Obviously, they were years when still the utopians around the Russian Revolution were alive, and people believed that the new, completely new city was still possible and desirable, and therefore the old city should be neglected. His teaching influenced the development in many American cities, no matter that happens 25 years later, and often the urban renewal which followed broad transformation which were not so convincing. Just to offer an example, these images of Boston. At this time, more or less the same time that the City Hall in Boston was built, this time in Italy, Ernesto Rogers, and I am so pleased that I am going to pay a tribute of recognition in raising this issue to Ernesto Rogers, the uncle of Richard Rogers, who is with us today, offered the Velasca Tower as an example of how to react given specific pre-existency ambientali. Rogers was the intellectual leader of the architectural community in Milan, and Paul has raised the issue of continuity. He calls Casabella continuità. This issue of just thinking that you are not alone, that you are living with something that you have received, it was very important, both culturally and even physically, as the matter of the city itself. Rogers indeed educated and helped the development of a lot of young architects of those years, just for mentioning some, let's say, Rossi, Aimonino, Policello, Canella, and also Vittorio Gregotti, who was probably one of his more well-wanted pupils in those days. I cited Vittorio Gregotti words about how he described of what this concept of pre-existenza ambientale should be understood. Says Vittorio something like that. It is also necessary to underline that for Rogers, the concept of pre-existenza ambientale is not completely explicable in a stylistic term, but rather a problem of principles and of methods against style, in no way excluding the value of meaning in architectural form. It corresponded to the idea of starting a dialogue. I like better the word conversation that Goldberger has mentioned. This dialogue with it corresponds to the idea of starting a dialogue, conversation with a way of seeing history from the point of view of contemporary culture. And such insert the historical material, the history, the materiality of the history that is conspicuous and visible in the city we have in the discussion of contemporary architecture, starting from a criticism of the socio-political conditions of the actual situation. Is still Gregotti. Then from the 50s on, there are numerous interventions in Milan characterized as research of the necessary compatibility between the principles of the modern that were not discussed. All those Italians very much wanted to be modern and yet able to deal with the pre-existenza ambientale, this critical relation with history and geography of the place. That is what probably Rogers was trying to do with raising this Torre Velasca that didn't have to do with the other contemporary skyscrapers in Milano, let's say Ponti, Pirelli, and instead, let's say, let me even daring to say, even the spirit of Milano present in this way of taking the photographs from the roof of the cathedral and Torre Velasca. This critical relation with history and geography of the place that culminated with the construction in 1958 with the Velasca Tower and the Museum of the Castello Sforzesco, two important monuments, clearly an homage to the city of Milan, manifestation of the idea of works of architecture as construction. The principles of Rogers were very much present and explicit in the Cartelas Sateres house, which enjoyed a broad success in those years. I ought to tell you that seen retrospectively, I wouldn't say the best Cartelas work, and yet it was so, let's say, extensively well received that was considered almost a classical model. Today, it smells too stylistic and too direct. And in yet, but this discussion, it was the matter of the discussions in the CIAM, and in the 1959, Rogers presented the Torre Velasca in those meetings of modern architects, and curiously, the resistance Allison and Peter Smithson manifested when the Velasca Tower was presented in the Siam of Waterloo in 1959 were later applied, in my view, to their most successful work that, for me, I consider to be their best, is this The Economist in London. Almost you are unable to see that. It is almost imperceptible in the street, and yet no doubt that the impression of this, or the awareness of this discussion that the Italians have raised was present in this work by Allison and Peter Smithson. This discussion was fertile and has been very much present since then, and rather with obstinacy, it has been stubbornly presented, this discussion, how to deal with the building in the historical city. Let me say something, and it can be said that Asplund's project in Gothenburg, even though built in the late 30s, was considered almost a premonition and the most effective illustration of the problem. Almost can be considered as the canon. I wonder whether we should underline how many of those, let's say, what could be considered canonical, let's say, directions or avenues to deal with just working and adding to an existing valuable building were in Asplund. Obviously, the way the symmetry is broken speaks about the freedom that architects would like to enjoy, but it can be said that whoever modern architect goes into making building in a classical atmosphere, in a historical atmosphere, having in mind, in the back of the mind, Asplund is something almost, let's say, undisputable. And yet, I believe that the issue is present today. This issue of how to proceed is quite pregnant today. But how to proceed when trying to keep alive the consistency of the old cities and not lose the contemporary spirit? How should an architect proceed? We could consider many alternatives. And among them, it has been said often that the answer to the problem comes through contextualization. What means, even badly interpreted, such contextualization that has also enjoyed a very bad reputation in recent years, encloses something close to a stylistic submission. I wouldn't say that at all. And obviously, in talking about context and contextualization, we will need to make many distinctions. Italians indeed wouldn't like just to consider that you get, let's say, an acceptable building in historical condition just when replicating and when mimicking what was already built. But the opposite has also very often affirmed a complete freedom, arguing that in the past and in any city, we can build without any concern for existing circumstances, since cities have in many cases proceeded in such a way. Both, either in one case or in the other, in both cases, in one and the other, the notion of buildings like objects, at the end, I guess that the understanding, and when again, Paul Goldberger mentioned today this Alberti attempt of produce these autonomous self-standing buildings, I would say that something of this reading of buildings as objects is quite clear there. And when we think in making something in a complex historical cities, we say, let's put a contemporary object there and allow it to live freely, without concerns about the respect that ought to be paid. The notion of buildings like objects ready to be assimilated by the whatever context seems to be a generalized approach for those who don't wish to recognize the constraints imposed by circumstances. My point today would be to say that buildings aren't only objects. In this moment, I resist myself a lot to believe that buildings and architects ought to consider buildings as just something that is, let's say, the realm of architects, and that they are mastering just the object they build, instead of extending and enlarging and broadening the notion of what it means to build. My point would be to say that buildings aren't only objects, and that the analogy between buildings and objects ignores the nature of the buildings which seek to be integrated as this, in my view, well-wanted continuity, only finally reaching their complete significance when engaged to the city. This implies that the commitment to the design of cities and buildings simultaneously, something that I would like it to happen, and marks the fantasy of the total prevalence and prevalence of architects designing autonomous singular buildings, and enlarges the role of the architect to react to the larger city. To think architects are making both buildings and cities, and that the role of the architect doesn't end up in the building is and therefore embodying a broader ground that would force to speak about city that is even larger. I realize that it's big and large than context, but I like better to think in those terms than just thinking that you are completing something like a scene. Architecture isn't the scenography, isn't just the fact of completing something that was already there. I would like I will present 4 projects that illustrate this point that very much would like to be clear today. One project is from the 80s, and it can be said that express clearly what is the example with Sevilla. It's a project in Sevilla which followed what can be seen almost like an extension of what we have learned from the discussion. I see this project and say, well, truly I tried to take advantage of what has been discussed about the historical cities by Italians. And then Murcia, which shows how buildings react against the circumstances, and so therein to acquire meaning. Why the meaning is something that shouldn't be neglected either. And then Cartagena, offering the proof that buildings aren't unable to be reduced to an object and stretch on themselves, producing just stretch on themselves, just making city, not only just buildings. And then lately, New York, manifesting how the notion of historical city isn't only the Italian European historical monumental cities, and showing how buildings respond to them, and buildings can respond, even in New York, in the same terms that we will do to an historical city in Europe. And let's try whether I am able to explain you these 4 buildings, just saying how they work. The first one is here, is this building there, building on the Guadalquivir, the river. You have some of the most important monuments in the city all around, the cathedral with the well-known tower of La Giralda, and then the house of Contratación by Herrera, and then the Alcázar, and then the university, building of late 18th century, and then the 19th century palace all around. Those buildings that are dynamizing the city fabric with this singularity that allowed to speak of monuments in the city, as was wanted by Rossi. And then the buildings should be there. The site that we need to do something was here. That was an empty site. That's a very well-kept urban fabric, and the street that was thought good to go this way directly into there. That was turned down when in the early 80s we were asked to do something there. And then and again, that drawings show how to be knowledgeable, how the fabric evolved and what still could be expected from the building was useful. And therefore, that explains how the city ended up in this world in 12th century, connecting with the tower that enclosed the river with a chain, and then all that was ignored when this road came parallel to the river, and then how the building should perhaps be, or should perhaps play the role of the world. I am not saying that memory is what matters, but to be aware of what is the logic that was behind the block that was defining such a clear piece in the entire city, indeed helped to find out that respecting the alignment in this case was going to be a good way of just providing this sort of background between La Torre del Oro and the Giralda. It's just stuff that doesn't disturb the presence of those very singular monuments. And therefore, I would like to say that the way we proceed was instead of just, let's say, taking or establishing any kind of axis or any kind of, let's say, preference or priority be given to the tower, we thought would be fine just get rid out whatever sense of just making frontally connecting the tower with the building, and instead bringing the entrance into the corner, bringing the entrance without keeping and maintaining just the independence of this piece that was so characteristic in the image of Sevilla. And then the building, in a way, is something that is very much value. Obviously, we are let's say, anything to be done with all those elements that characterize a civilian urban fabric, and yet there is something in common with them. And I would say there is the fact that we are working with a very tiny elements. The city of Sevilla is indeed, but in those monuments that you have seen, it hasn't this monumentality. And therefore, the building at the end is the result of just a lot of ingredients embedded in the brick fabric, but then there are marble and columns and cast iron and small details at the end, unperceptible, and as I said, absorbed entirely by the fabric of the building. And some images from the interior, and then how the building at the end merges. I like very often to think good architecture is so explicit that at the end architecture, or let's say buildings, are part of this fabric and then don't need to ask for blatant protagonism, and instead they are able to let's say, to be part of this existing block that you have seen, and somehow the building plays just and enhances the remainders of the old world of the city, and assumes this condition of rare facade just for not imposing the hierarchy of the certain institutional building vis-a-vis all those humble small pieces. And I would say that the same happened when you look at the building as a whole. The building as a whole indeed pays, let's say, underlines the fact that it belongs to the block much more than just thinking that it is asking to be recognized by its powerful presence. Now this that was in our site here. It happens to be another small tower from the wall that was connected like that and like that. And this site has been already built. It doesn't belong to the same property than ours, but ours is making all that. The building we are going to see now is another different building. In a way, I would say that Seville, seen retrospectively, could be taken as a clear example of what this Italian discussion was able to put in architects' hands to solve this problem of building in the historical atmosphere. And yet, what we will see now is a bit more complex, because the issue of meaning, the issue of how the building wants to play a certain institutional role, that gives to the design a much more profound interest. You have here the Murcia Cathedral that is there, the late Gothic cathedral with a very powerful facade built above an existing mosque, and then later Cardinal, the Bishop Palace, which has the name of a cardinal that happens to be in the middle of 18th century Murcia, and then later the city hall that is there, the city hall that hasn't to do with is just against this public church presided by the church's public space. And then actually the issue would be, by filling up this corner there, how we would be able to bring the civil power that is there into this public space that ended up being the most characteristic and the most valuable public space of Plaza in Murcia. And you have here the way it was. We needed to do something there. We needed to do something there. You have the three sides of the plaza. You have the cathedral, and then the building that was given to us, and then the Cardinal Palace, and then this kind of plaza. And it seems to me that it was a good opportunity for transforming space that was like that in something that could recognize this depth with the Roman world, making a plaza that connected the palace of the cardinal with the cathedral, and yet being able also to enter in the scene the civil power that the city hall present. The city hall is in the other side, as I said, and by so making this building, it has, let's say, the balcony that hasn't the power of the cardinal, and yet allow the mayor to be present, as I said, in the most important public space of this small city of Murcia. Then here we have this drawing that shows quite clearly the conditions where the big retablo-like Baroque facade of the Murcia Cathedral, and then the Bishop Palace, and then all those early 20th century small bourgeoisie residences, small houses all around, and then we clean up the plaza of all of those things that happen to be there, and instead we slightly reduced, because when we went, you needed to go up into the cathedral, going up through steps, going up, then by lowering and making something like this concave space in the plaza, you would be able to give again this sense of going up into the cathedral facade, and then what was going to be our building. Both buildings were facing each other. Obviously, and again, I consider that be careful with the alignments, as we saw in the Asplund, and what was so emphasized by those theoreticians talking about how to work in the historical cities is there. I didn't dare to came just making the connection of these two roads. Instead, I maintained the bending conditions of the road. I made those of basalt with travertine, even going directly into the Piranesi images of Roman piazzas. And then, and curiously, this image shows something that is quite important, that you are ever going to be both the facades at once. In a way, we have seen in Asplund that you have both buildings. Both buildings became just a single view. You were able to separate one building from the other. Here, it happens exactly the opposite. You were in the space that was shared by both buildings, our building and the cathedral, but never, ever, those two buildings were going to be seen at once. You see the cathedral front with let's say, the filter, and with the foreground of the existing building. Here, and again, ought to be said that by so doing, we are, let's say, giving up, making a big door here. Even by taking out the sense of entering from the plaza, you are giving to this building both the more specific connection with the city throughout this side road, as well as the connection with the city hall throughout a bridge that happened to be there. And then here you are seeing again the facade from there, and there we can, what can be said, the result. I give indeed value to the fact that we don't have here a door. The door is in the side, so the building maintains this presence, and yet doesn't disturb the prevalence and the priority that this building had before we went there. The building obviously reduces the presence, if you wanted, of the other more modest buildings. Obviously, discuss the height of this building was a key issue. You realize that is something like a loggia, but obviously, I indeed still believe that we couldn't reduce the height of that if you didn't want the other buildings to take the protagonist that seems to me should have all the other buildings around. And here, again, the small bridge connecting that with the city hall. This drawing shows so clearly that we were talking about the facade that wants to be an alternative to the, let's say, to the Baroque retablo that was the cathedral. Here we are coming with the retablo that doesn't have any, let's say, mimic reference of iconographical reference to the cathedral, and yet the structure is, it can be said, is the same. You are structuring the retablo, just giving this frontal view. This frontal view happens here as well. The frontal view that, again, doesn't enhances, isn't taking advantage of any symmetry, just the contrary, just showing the sort of randomness, of freedom in the way columns and all that are located. Here we have the same at night. And here again, no doubt that we are building that, let's say, with you could speak about minimalism, you could speak about this sense of going out and recognizing even the aesthetic content behind this way of enjoying. Obviously, horizontals are just crisp, verticals are playing this game of rhythms, proportions. We are talking of something that would allow to speak of a certain, let's say, using or working with very traditional architectural devices, I ought to speak about proportions. I ought to speak about this clarity of the construction means, rhythms, altogether a certain sense of extensional musical condition of the entire facade that plays, as I said, with this retablo. And yet the building provides and has its own heart, and it can be said that even, let's say, shows from this public building, the entire city takes another phase. And here we see the result. At the end, we are not designing just the building itself. Isn't, as I said, an object. Is a building that tries to deal with the road system of the street, tries to deal with this symbolic value to be given to the balcony and to be given to the city, to the mayor, sharing with the bishop, let's say, the best public space in the town. Obviously, handling those corners, those interstitial spaces and voids that gives this very subtle presence of the rounded corner of the rounded corner of the city hall. We're going to see now something that is quite different, because in a way, difficult to speak about buildings here. The issue was how to keep this Roman theater to be embedded in the city fabric, because this city theater curiously has been rescued in the last 10 years. That is an image of 1950s. The theater is here. Anybody knew, curiously, that the Roman theater was below, and actually you see there the entrance to this small local cathedral, and yet when the builders turning down what used to be one of the most decayed neighborhood of this the harbor city in the south of Spain, when they started to do that, they found out some steps that shouldn't be bad grades or steps of the theater, and turning down, they were slowly but steadily turning down houses and finding out that. And once that they had that, they said, what should we do with that? Obviously, that came in Spain also after the very serious discussion about what it has been rebuilt, an entire theater, Roman theater, almost remaking the theater. And then instead of that, the archaeologists said, no, it's better to keep the thing almost like this archaeological remainder. And in this moment came out the idea of just making this kind of connection. You have this was a small palace, and then you go up with those steps into this point, and from this small museum, putting together the remainders that has been found in the excavation, and then you go almost like the latest room is this large room that is the entire Roman theater. And then you see there the lower floor, the middle floor, and then you move throughout under the street, and you come here. That is the lobby that holds the stair going up and coming to this terrace that allows the view of the cathedral. And then later, that is an access from the street here, from the street there. Sorry. The street and crossing the street. And then we are coming here again, and the lobby with all those remainders. The theater was pretty good because the Roman conquered to the Cartagineses, to the Phoenicians, and built under Augustus, one of the nicest theaters in the Mediterranean. You go up and you go down under the cathedral, and you go down under the cathedral, and you ended up into the, and then we've made in black on darker art the two pieces of that has been found there, and then you see how it works in the entire fabric. And then the issue now was, well, what we should do with that. Obviously, that is the last room in this small museum, but when you go up, it can be said that you have embedded in this void that from here is something like a balcony, allowing you to see the city, and so enlarging virtually the size of this small park. I would say that it's so important to get rid of this idea of just thinking that contextualization and to work in historical city means just only this way of replicating all styles. And that could be seen even more clearly in this latest building in New York. You have the perspectives from McKinley and White, late 19th century. I ought to tell you that I considered McKinley and White such a extraordinary architects with such a masters in establishing dual strategies, the way they have kept and absorbed and embedded by the city the entire campus, and just don't disturbing the continuity either of Broadway or New Amsterdam, and yet later you end up with all this agora-like structure of the campus. That the site we were given was this corner, that this is going to play a much more important role in the immediate future, where in addition to those existing transversal gates to the campus, this corner access from here will be crucial. And then the building, and then that I ought to tell you, and that for me is very important, to think about this building not anymore like a single building, but think that this building as just something that takes advantage of the clarity of McKinley and White strategy, and saying, well, why we don't make and maintain just the set of dimensions, and then keeping those, are we able to establish this change of buildings that altogether reinforces the role of the departments in the entire university. And it's true that the building is very simple, but the building ought to have extraordinary complex circumstances and conditions, because it should jump above an existing gym, and then that makes that both facades are going to hold entirely the building, and then the building has such a complexity. I have another image that shows just so clearly, and the building, how the building touches the street, the building, and again, because it reinforces enjoys and take advantage of these corner-like conditions to make the gate to the campus, a gate that has both the social space of this cafe and those stairs going up, and then the building, and again, hasn't anymore the very, let's say, rhetoric entrance. The gate is ignored, but you realize that something is happening there, and it happens almost also as this welcome reception that the university would like to give to this image showing how the building jumps about the gymnasium, some images from the cafe, of the library, of the construction. But there are those system of distances what matters. I would say that the thing that I liked was to make the building part of this broader, let's say, already defined and built much more complex, I wouldn't say it's not architectural entity, it's this piece of the city that, in my view, actually didn't need the singular building as much as reinforcing the value that the campus as a whole had. And therefore, difficult to say that is exactly. Now we will need to talk about issues as texture, issues of this randomness, and yet this determination established by the static conditions of the building. But all those things belongs in a way to this architectural world that I would like now to be merged entirely with this understanding of what the city asks for, even more, much more than just thinking in the autonomy of a single building. And having said that, I would like that you understood what I tried to say with the title of this lecture. Thank you very much.